Both saturated fat and refined sugars can interfere with lean muscle growth over time. Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. And again, I know this is going to be a bit of a controversial statement, but if you really start looking deep into the data, it actually does make sense. And again, you're going to get people who say, well, there's lots of people who eat lots of red meat and saturated fat who've gained muscle. Yes, that's true, but they also struggle with gaining a lean muscle, right? Because you're dealing with potential insulin resistance in the muscle tissue. You're dealing with issues then with giving nutrients to your muscle tissue accordingly when that happens. And so therefore, what ends up happening? Well, you end up having to eat certain foods in higher amounts in order to facilitate the muscle growth you want, and it just makes it more difficult to gain the muscle tissue in a lean manner. And the same thing when we're dealing with refined sugars. And people will bring this up and they'll say, okay, so maybe people shouldn't be eating too many carbohydrates because it will interfere with insulin sensitivity, but most carbohydrates don't interfere with insulin sensitivity, do they? And people say, okay, well, only the refined ones. Yeah, but to some extent, not all refined carbohydrates really do. Do some particularly improve it? Yes, high fiber carbohydrates, absolutely can help enhance insulin sensitivity. Others are going to be a little more neutral, stuff like white rice, white flour, things. They're not necessarily going to make it worse, though. Okay, they're not really the big issue, but the refined sugars will. They'll also cause things like fatty liver, more inflammation in the body. So when we're talking about refined sugars, we are talking about refined fructose. And that would be fructose that is going to be in a free form when it reaches the bloodstream. In other words, it has a very short digestion time. It doesn't reach the lower intestine where your gut flora ferments it into glucose, which is what you want. So examples would be table sugar. Okay, that's an easy one. Everyone knows that one. The chemical name for that is sucrose. So when you're looking at America, you're looking at the ingredient list. It will be just called sugar, and sometimes they'll call it sucrose. Okay, but they're referring specifically to table sugar, which is again sucrose. That will do it. High fructose corn syrup, the other really big one. And it's not arguably worse. A lot of times people say, well, it's worse because there's a small amount higher fructose to glucose ratio. That's true, but in the grand scheme of things, it's so insignificant that if you're consuming comparable amounts, the difference will be too small to really measure. So it's not really worse. So a lot of times people will say, well, I eat the table sugar instead of that stuff. I'm like, you're really not doing yourself any favors because the difference is so small that it may not be a practical difference. But those are your big ones. And of course, things like honey. And again, it's not to say that honey doesn't have some beneficial stuff in it. Of course it does. But it's also got a bunch of refined fructose that you absorb in your upper intestine and hence the bloodstream as fructose, which technically it poisons into your body and your liver will eventually have to deal with it and process it. Tends to cause fatty liver in excess, tends to cause insulin resistance. Okay. Insulin resistance, again, lack of insulin sensitivity, not a good thing when we are trying to gain muscle tissue. And the reason for that is because, again, more insulin sensitivity means we do not get a proper healthy insulin response. And what does that mean? That means our muscles do not get as much of the energy as we might want. It then has to create larger insulin responses in order to shuttle all the glucose and blood sugar into cells and even get into your muscle tissue. And then that can then, of course, facilitate them when it gets high enough going into other cells in the body. Now, it can be even more pronounced when dealing with saturated fat. Why? Because saturated fat has been found to even cause insulin resistance in muscles. Not just various tissues in the body, but even in muscle tissue. Because what ends up happening, saturated fatty acids tend to almost gum up the keyhole. And this is the way I've even seen leading researchers in the field describe it. That if you think of the insulin receptor all through the cells in your body, but again, specifically muscle tissue here, as like a keyhole, and then when you put a key in it, that would be insulin, it turns the lock. And that opens it up and allows the glucose to transport into the muscle cells. Okay, it's a transporter, but it's like unlocks it. All right, saturated fat, specifically due to the chemical natures of it, tend to gum those receptor holes up. So it's almost like someone coming along and taking some of the keyholes along there and putting a little bit of glue or some gunk or some grease in them to make it harder, like it gums them up and it's harder for the insulin to get in. Okay, well, the way receptors work in the body, when they cannot get what you want, your body has to create more of them. Because if you have more of whatever it is that you have a receptor for, even if the receptor sensitivity is down, it will force itself in if you give enough of it there, right? You just have more of it hitting. Eventually, you'll get more of them that push through. That's essentially how receptors work when they're resistant to various hormones and stuff in the body. If you just add more of it, you're good. So as blood sugar rises, if you're insulin resistant there, your body then has to kick up the insulin even higher to deal with it. But normally that wouldn't be a bad thing. Normally they're like, oh man, insulin, great for muscle tissue. More insulin, more blood glucose going into the cell. But in this case, it's not good because it's having to do it because it's not working correctly. Okay? So when that happens, not only is it then harder for our muscle tissue to get the glucose, right? It's harder for it to get the glucose and get the fuel. It's now forcing it into other tissues at a higher rate also, which again means it is not getting as much into the muscles. It's going to other cells in your body, maybe cells you don't want to be getting lots of glucose, cancer cells, maybe some of your fat cells around your organs, the ones under your skin, not so much. But definitely the ones around your organs. So that what ends up happening is due to the insulin resistance that's there, we're going to have to get more carbohydrate, more glucose, all of these things to get the fuel that you need into your muscle tissue. And then it ends up fueling more of the tissue around your organs, all the fat and everything around there, the visceral fat. So again, the end result is it interferes with lean gains over time. And in an ideal world, you would want to maximize insulin resistance. And if you maximize insulin resistance by, again, eating very high fiber carbs, okay, right? We maximize insulin sensitivity. We do those things or eat healthier fats that improve it, like polyunsaturated fats. What happens? We don't need as much carbohydrate. We don't even always need as much protein and everything to shuttle the nutrients that we want into our muscle tissue. And accordingly, it allows for easier, leaner gains in muscle. And this is what we want. We want to gain as much muscle usually as possible while gaining as little fat as possible, and maybe in a perfect world, even losing fat. High insulin sensitivity helps you achieve that. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.